Wow. Hello, everybody. What a session we just had. A lot of things to think about and consider when it comes to the ethics of and looking after the vulnerable population. Thank you so much, Michael and Denise and Lucy, for the information and guidance that you've shared. Now, we have a treat for you folks to round up our day. And thank you to all that you've been staying with us. I would like to introduce you to our last speaker for the day, Diana Kelley, who is the CISO at Protect AI. Diana, hello. Thank you for coming and joining us.
Hi, Nasia. Thanks so much for having me here.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. And Diana, you will be talking to us about smart, secure, and sustainable industrial IoT. So I'm looking forward to your presentation. So with that, I will hand it over to you and we'll talk afterwards.
Okay, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for having me here. I'm just gonna see about getting the slides started. Okay, there we go. So yeah, to get started, we're gonna be talking about how we can make IoT and IIoT. So the Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things. And our previous speakers had a really great point about that if you get in your car, you're basically driving an IoT device. And what's interesting is that you're driving both a computer and an IoT device, because there is a little bit of a difference between IoT, IIoT, and what we hold in our hands as our phones. And computers and cars are one of those devices that are now combining all of them. And everything really just comes down to this one big convergence reality that there's a lot. There's a lot of these devices as we look out to today and to the future. 41.6 billion devices in a couple of years is going to be the reality with IoT. 79 zettabytes of data that's going to be contained on there. And that one, we heard so much from that previous panel, really doing a deep dive on data isn't just this kind of this external thing that's, it's a technical thing that's not connected to us. Data is very important. It can be connected back to us. Very often data is about us. So even though it's been extracted, it can be very much about us, about who we are, about where we are, about what we're doing. And IoT and IIoT are in large part the devices that are gathering that information. And then how much money is going to be spent on the security of it? Well over $5 billion. And this is for the security of IoT. Obviously, as we're talking about the total spend in IoT and IIoT, that number is much, much larger. And I think, quite frankly, that's actually a little bit small if we look across the globe as we look at overall IoT and IIoT. Now, as what's at stake, and the previous panel did such a fantastic job of talking about what's at stake ethically, personally, right? We heard a lot about the children and what if an adult buys a phone and then hands it to a child? How can we age gate who's using these systems? But children are very much users of IoT. And also the other side of what can go wrong when we look at insecurity and vulnerability within IoT. Some of the big headlines that have gotten out, and I'm not a fan of the big scary headlines. People, when we talk about technology, if you get too scary with security, people just shut down because it's like, I don't want to hear it. I just want to use these devices. So I don't want to be too scary about IoT or IoT and what can happen if it goes wrong. But it's meaningful for all of us to at least think about what's at stake. And so technically what's at stake with children, for example, it's not just how they're interacting with the devices and the information they may be giving out to a device, but also the IoT devices that we're surrounding our children with. For example, a baby monitor. There have been in the news cases where baby monitors have been hacked, and baby monitors are now not just audio, they're very often video, and they're bi-directional. So you can hear, you can also speak. And there have been actual examples of a parent coming into the room of their child where they've got the baby monitor or the child monitor device and hearing a voice that they don't know. And it's someone in some other part of the world saying, your child looks very cute, or what a pretty child. So that means that someone else was monitoring or being able to view your child. So we need to secure these devices. Another big part of where IoT lives is actually in us. Implantable medical devices, they're IoT devices, whether it's the pacemaker that you've got that's managing your heartbeat if you should need one, or perhaps a insulin pump, an onboard insulin pump. We are more and more wearing medical devices, and we also very often we have a lot of devices that aren't quite medical, but in the medical space, which are just health monitors. Most people do nowadays wear a device like that. But even deeper, these ones that are actually implanted or attached to our bodies, these are IoT devices. What does that mean? It means that they're on the internet, they're communicating, and they're managing some aspect, or at least reporting on some aspect of your health. In the case of a defibrillator or implantable medical device for your heart, or the insulin pump, it's actually managing your health. It's a part of your health system at this point, your personal ecosystem of health. These, if we don't protect them, and the insulin pump, very well-known attack from a few years ago was someone who actually has his own insulin pump that he wore. He realized that there was no authentication to his own insulin pump. And that meant that somebody that got close enough to him that knew that there was a vulnerability in that device could have released all of the insulin in the pump to him, which could have put his life at risk. Another thing that we manage with IoT and IIoT, industrial IoT devices, is water. We see this, our systems, they are managing, is there too much water? Is there too little water? A refrigeration system for a large retailer, for example, did that truck get over a certain temperature while it was driving through a very part of the country? Does that mean that the food or the produce inside is still safe to consume? Is our water safe to drink? So we are using these systems. They are incredible sensors that help us to manage our world, be able to see if our child is safe, keep ourselves safe, but that means we have to keep these systems safe. And as I was thinking about this and doing a lot of research, I actually did some work while I was, so what could go wrong? Things like the disruption in infrastructure. We've seen this with ransomware gets in, cold chain storages, as I was talking about, the heat. Communication is another one. We are so dependent right now on our devices for maintaining communication and governance and visibility. And then it can even get up to national safety concerns, depending on how we're using those IoT or IIoT devices, anywhere from just a factory that we need to supply or manufacture systems and pieces of military equipment, for example, all the way up to what we embed within that military equipment. If the supply chain is disrupted during the manufacturing process, for example, it's quite possible that what we're putting out in theater, what we're using for our national defense, may not be as robust or secure as we want it to be. So thinking about that, and as I said, I don't love when people get scared. I hope that I didn't scare you. I hope that this was really just a level set on this. These devices are very, very important for a variety of different security and safety reasons. But always for security, and what I think the most important thing is to understand what can happen, the impacts, the likelihood of the impacts, the risks, and then really understanding the root causes so that we can take steps to make these systems more secure from the get-go. So when I was at IBM Security, I did some research around how could we distill down the security of IoT and IIoT to some indisputable facts that are going to ultimately be very important for us going forward to make sure that we are addressing IoT in a responsible way. We're building it in a responsible way. And these are the 5 indisputable facts that I, along with some other very much smarter than me engineers and scientists at IBM Security, came up with. And the first one was that we need to understand that these devices are going to operate in hostile environments. And that's a really critical thing to think about, because a lot of times when you think about a laptops, right, they were, especially earlier ones, they're very delicate. And phones, for example, right, remember back in the day, somebody would drop their phone in the water and it was, oh my gosh, my phone is terrible. Put it in a big bag of rice, for example. But now we've got phones. This is a waterproof phone, essentially. I mean, I wouldn't want to take it and go deep sea diving with this. But if I drop this in water, and not this one, but an earlier version of this phone, I did actually drop into a sink full of water early on in owning it. And it was just fine, because we have now realized that in some ways, because human beings are carrying their mobile devices around, that they are operating in hostile environments. In IoT, it's absolutely hostile. First of all, because a lot of times they're going outside into the weather, and weather can be very hostile. And it feels like every year the weather feels maybe a little bit more hostile. It's a little hotter. It's a little bit more. If we're using IoT to, for example, help to understand the water and the water within the earth and the ground around our forests, because there may be a forest fire, that IoT device is probably at some point could actually be in a fire itself. No, we may not need to be able to. We may not be able to create all of our IoT that's going to be resilient to the high heat of a forest fire, but we could certainly make sure it's okay in the high heat of 110 or 120 degree Fahrenheit summer weather, which we're getting pretty frequently, for example, here in the United States. And I know in parts of Europe, there have been some very high temperatures as well. And I should know the Celsius conversion, but unfortunately, I'm not able to do that off the top of my head. But you get the drift, that we need to understand these devices are going to operate in hostile environments. Okay, the next one is that software security, it degrades over time. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that the software itself gets worse and worse, but it does mean that as the software is out there for a longer amount of time, that more vulnerabilities can be found in it. And this is just a truism of software overall. This is a reality of the software, whether it's a mobile app that you're using, whether it's your operating system on your laptop, whether it's the operating system or one of the telematic operating systems within your car. Over time, we find that there are issues that get discovered and become found out about the software that we're using. So you want to make sure that you take into account that, yes, software security over time becomes something that is not as robust as it was when you originally launched it. And something that connects to that on the time-based is that shared secrets don't remain secret. And what does that mean? That means that if you have a hard-coded password in your IoT device, for example, which a lot of them do, or if it's a password that's known. Early on, when IoT devices were shipping, it was not uncommon for a manufacturer to have the exact same password for access to all of the devices that they shipped. So every device had the same default password. Just great if, as you set up that device, you go in and you change the password, well, they don't have the same password. But if people don't change that password, then that means that every IoT device from that manufacturer has the same password that gives access. Very often that's the root or the admin access that password connects to, which, as you could imagine, could create quite a lot of risk. And over time, these get out. There are online, you can find in storage and other repositories that people will share this information. You know, this vendor, all of their routers or all of their IoT devices or all of their sensors have this password to get on as root or admin initially. And that information gets propagated around the internet, and then attackers are able to now know this information. And there have been quite a number of attacks where they have been used, things like CCTV cameras that can be used. The attacker knows the password to all of the CCTVs, for example, can either stop the CCTVs, those closed cameras, from operating, which could allow an attack or an event to occur that would not be recorded properly, or weaponizing IoT, which we've seen in a number of cases too, where it's not that they want that IoT device to not work per se. What they really want is they want to use the connectivity and the power of the IoT device in order to launch another kind of attack, like a denial of service or a distributed denial of service, for example. The fourth indisputable fact about IoT and IoT security is that if you launch something in an insecure state, it's most likely that people are going to keep it in an insecure state. If your security mindset, you may go in and actually raise that state to a more secure state, But even security folks will often kind of default to the easy mode of, is it working? And if you've ever had to set up a network in your house, for example, and set up your Wi-Fi, you get it working and you're like, it's working, yay. And if you're in charge of a number of IoT devices on a manufacturing shop floor, for example, or out in an agricultural environment, you get those up and running, and that feels, or a building automation system, you get it up and running and you go, okay, this is good. And the sort of the most of us just are, we kind of step away and we say, it's good. I got it running. But if it's in a weak configuration, that can be very, very risky because, again, it's not the most robust, it's not the most secure way to set up and manage your systems. So if you have a system that when you first launch it, it launches in a weak state, and the manufacturer may have a little bit of a note in the configuration about, well, this is how to harden up that system. Keep in mind that it's not very common that organizations will harden up that system or people will harden up that system. It's very often that they will stay in that weak configured state. And then the last one of the 5 indisputable facts that give us this baseline to create a much more secure, much more robust approach is that as data continues to accumulate, and this we heard a lot from our previous speakers, as data accumulates, that means that there are more and more exposures to issues. So the more that we have data, the more, first of all, data about what we're gathering is going to exist. The other thing is that as we gather more of this data about people and about things, that it's very likely that that data can then be used in other ways that aren't expected. So a great example of this is with GPS. And as we travel around and we have our locations and our access, what we do and how we and where we're going can be tracked by these systems. Do we want that information about us? Do you want that information about us? There's a lot of data that gets tracked. Our cars, again, they are where we go, the data about us goes. So thinking about this data that IoT is gathering, and one of the great things about IoT and IoT is that they're signals and they are sensors and that they are gathering this data that can be used, but we need to consider what's being collected and how it's being used. So let's get to the sustainability. How are we going to address those root causes now that we understand them? How can we all be smarter about the systems that not only that we're using, that we're purchasing, both at home and at our businesses, but also how can manufacturers be stronger and more robust about the kinds of IoT and IoT that they are building and selling? And if you think, well, I'm not a builder, as you look at these, what you can think is that you can ask the vendors and the manufacturers that you're buying IoT or IIoT from. So IoT, if it's going to be the cameras that you're using to monitor that new beautiful headquarters that you're building. IIoT, you're a retailer and you want to make sure that you've got the temperatures right and all your freezers around your retail sites to make sure that that ice cream doesn't melt and become unsellable. So what can we do? So you always, as the buyer, as the purchaser, you have actually the ability to impact what the vendors are creating. Because if you say, it matters to me that security is built in, it matters to me that we've got sustainable long-term usability within these systems, then they are going to be more incented to actually build them in. A lot of times we forget that we have the power, whether we're building it or we're buying it, but we have the power on both sides. All right, so what can we do? First of all, that hostile environments that I had discussed. Number one, build better hardware. I talked about that my phone is waterproof now, and it can go into the water. So putting the money into creating more robust hardware. And again, as buyers, this is something we're going to have to ask about, but creating hardware that's resistant for the hostile environment it's going to be operating in. If it's outside in high heat, if it's outside in rain, for example, making sure that it's robust in whatever use case is necessary. Having network segmentation on even those devices themselves, because there are multiple networks within systems or devices. Again, the previous speaker on the panel said about the car being an IoT computer. I was talking to an automotive engineer at one of the big automakers, and I said, how many networks are actually in the car? And it was in like over 100. And I said, but that doesn't make any sense. I could understand there's sort of a more OT operational side and IT side, which is where I'm getting my music and maybe looking at attaching my phone. He said, no, because on each of the actual systems themselves, there was segmentation. So creating that segmentation and that separation. And this is a huge way to add security, because it means that if one part of the system is attacked, that the blast radius is contained. So even within the IoT and the IoT devices, asking for network segmentation on the systems and also in how we set up and deploy the devices. This matters on shop floors, for example. I was working with one company that had a very large, very sensitive manufacturing shop floor. And they said that one of the biggest problems that they'd ever had was that they had a soda machine that they plugged in, but it was an IoT soda machine because it could go out to the internet and tell the person who managed the machine if they were getting low on soda, for example. But that one, they didn't have segmentation between where the soda machine went and where the manufacturing shop floor was. So not just buying systems that are properly segmented, but also when you install them, segment them. And that really goes back to that zero trust kind of approach and making sure that you're going to trust but verify every connection within your IoT or IoT estate. And then using things like a hardware root of trust within the hardware itself, so that you know that when it boots, for example, as it runs, that you've got a secure space there to create a secure starting point. Okay, what can we do about the security that software degrades over time, right? That one. Well, we can make better software. And that is by using a secure software development lifecycle. And if you're saying, but we're super agile, we're totally DevOps, it's okay. You don't need to go back to waterfall to create a secure software development lifecycle. You can approach it in a very, very modern way by going with DevSecOps. Just make sure that you've got security woven throughout the system. And in a DevOps lifecycle, that means that security starts at the very beginning of that process and that you weave security touch points throughout the entire DevOps lifecycle so that you're putting out the most robust software you can. Is that going to mean that there's never any vulnerability in your software? Nah, you're going to have to update the software too. You're going to have stronger and more resilient software, but it will need to be updated. So having a way to update, so over-the-air updates or some other way to patch these systems will be absolutely critical to ensure that as that software may quote unquote degrade, that you've got a way to patch it and make it stronger. Also think about how do you replace that hardware, because that hardware is going to fail too. So being able to get a sensor, a warning if that hardware is about to fail, a component's about to fail, using IoT itself to censor out the potential degradation within the system, and have planned replacement programs. This is both for the forklift upgrades. You may just need to pull out all of it, all the hardware, all the software, and replace the systems. Technology advances all the time. Sometimes it's just time to upgrade. In other cases, that planned replacement may be just around the software itself or the firmware that's running, but making sure that you have some kind of plan or process in place. Doesn't mean you have to replace everything every day or every year, but do have some plan for it, because otherwise what you get is really rusty, crickety old systems that haven't been patched or addressed in years and years. And that's where the real vulnerabilities start to come in. For that shared secret piece, that, you know, the number one thing is just don't have, as a vendor, don't have hard-coded passwords at all. You know, always have a password that, and don't have repeated shared password, the same password for every single device. If you do have a password that's the same for every device, so the root password, then as that first boot, when that system comes online for the very first time, make sure that there's a forced password change, or use some kind of non or passwordless solution like a token or a key. And again, make sure that these are either rotated or are stored securely so that they cannot be tracked or hacked by the attackers. And then make sure that you, as much as possible, control who can have access to those systems. Now, if you've got an agricultural sensor, it may be out in a field somewhere, for example, making, you know, again, checking the groundwater or the crops about to go through drought, are they too dry? That's going to have some level of access either from a bird or from a person. Birds are very pecky. They go after things. They're curious. But, you know, also if you've got something like a shop floor, for example, just making sure that the IoT isn't fully available. Wi-Fi is a great example of this. You'll see like the wireless access points. A lot of times companies will just kind of slap them up wherever in public areas. Very easy to tamper with these kinds of systems if they don't have security around them. So where it's at all possible, make sure that you've got controlled access both physically to the systems and also importantly controlled access to the management and the dashboard consoles of those systems. The weak configuration is a great way to countermeasure this one is to actually bring them out and I would really recommend that a lot more manufacturers do this. Bring systems that go into the strong space originally so that it's a really strong configuration and let people then make the decision to reduce some of that security over time. I know that that's very non-standard, that it's just a lot of manufacturers prefer, I just want it up and running as quickly as possible. But I do think that if you have the option for people to step down the security rather than force them to step it up, that can help quite a bit overall, especially in these very high sensitivity use cases for IoT and most importantly, IIoT. Another way that we can address this is that fail closed. So if there is a problem or a vulnerability that's found in that system, rather than just saying, oh, all the security is off. And this reminds me of the old We're in France attack, where this is going back decades, but it used to be that there were different encryption standards in France and in other parts of the world. So all you had to do was to tell a Microsoft server that it was in France, and it would say, oh, all the encryption is turned off. And that was it. So you just changed the location and now you didn't have to deal with any encryption on that server. That's kind of a failed open in a sense, in that you say I'm in one place and then the security protections of encryption are gone. The opposite of that is to fail closed. And fail closed is when you if there's a failure, if there's an issue with the configuration, if there's tampering going on, that system actually blocks access. Now, when things fail closed, especially in IoT, you do have to take in consideration availability and keeping those systems going, especially in operational technology environments. So I know this isn't just an easy, sure, just always fail closed, but do consider that fail closed because that can give you that little leg up, especially if an attacker tampers with something and the result is fail open for the security components. Another big thing that can help quite a bit is just reminders, whether it's your management console that you're using to govern and to manage all of your IoT or IoT systems, or on the IoT system itself, just reminding people you need additional security. This is how to increase your security. If you're going to change this setting or this configuration, know that it may be introducing new risk. Do people always pay attention? Not always, but it sure is better than not warning people at all and not reminding them. And then the last point about how do we countermeasure those big five indisputable facts to make sustainable IoT is to take a look at our data management life cycle. So a lot of companies may look at data management because they think about, oh, I've got intellectual property in my company and my emails, and we've got this document that we've written. We've got our schematics and our new blueprints for our the next iteration of our great product. But do you data manage the life cycle that's being collected in the signals and the sensors throughout your IoT environment? A lot of companies don't. So the data management lifecycle of IoT and IIoT may be kind of a little bit outside of the normal operations. You also often find that at very large companies, especially in industrial, ICS, industrial control, you may find that there's two sets of security. There's the OT security lead. There could be a CISO for OT and a CISO for IT. The understanding, the learning that we have about protecting our data within the IT environment, we need to ensure that we can expand and enhance that knowledge in the IoT environment. Because again, very often I've seen that they have been separated. Make sure that you're getting that same level of rigor and you're applying it over to the signal and the sensor and the information from your IoT. And if you're thinking, it's just a bunch of temperatures or it's just a bunch of information about water, what could go wrong? I have to say, my eyes were very opened by the head of security for an electrical company once, and I said exactly that. I said, what does it matter if an attacker understands the electrical usage of somebody in their house? He said, well, for one thing, it could give you an indicator of their religion. And it's like, how? Well, if they stop using electricity at the normal rate, if it goes down significantly at sundown on Friday, that may indicate to you that they're celebrating the Sabbath. And that could indicate to you that family is Jewish. And I realize that there are a lot of different ways that this information can be tracked and utilized, that until you start the threat modeling and thinking it through, it's not always apparent, just like me with the energy usage. So think about the data lifecycle, apply it over into your IoT. We are gathering. Machine learning is really changing how we're doing business, especially AI and generative AI, which can be fueled by machine learning. Machine learning itself is fueled by data. So making sure that the data that we get from IoT and IoT devices is used responsibly as part of that data lifecycle management. And then ensuring that the models that we're driving to manage or fuel our IoT are also being protected. And there's a really great, there's some great work that's going on in the Industrial IoT Consortium. They have a security maturity model. I know it's a little bit hard to read. I've got the link here at the bottom. You can go look this up. It's the IIC SMM, but it's a really wonderful way to think about how we gather and we expand maturity throughout the governance, enablement, and hardening of our systems. So a lot of what I talked about is really brought up into this framework that you can go, you could either stop at those 5 or you can go a little bit deeper. I really strongly, if whether you buy or you use IoT or you're creating it, I really hope that you'll go deeper, because the security, as I was trying to point out at the beginning, really matters so much to our safety in the world right now, both for people and for the systems that we use to support our health and our safety. So this is a great model to take a look at and to begin to really bring ahead your security. And just looking forward, I really hope that you'll take a deeper look in thinking about the security of IoT. It can be very sustainable and very green. And I hope that by keeping track of it and building security in, that you will have a safer IoT future. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, so much. That was enlightening in many ways, and I particularly enjoyed the many use cases that threw out in there. And even though you try not to scare us all, we had a question from the audience that said, okay, so what will happen if we don't set up our IoT devices, taking into account, all the good security measures that you mentioned, and you've been answering through your presentation what might happen, right? But I think we need to scare people a little bit more in closing.
I mean, what might happen is that these systems don't operate as expected. So depending on what the use case of that system is. So again, back to the implantable medical device, what can happen is that your pacemaker does not work anymore. And that means that your heart doesn't beat. If your father's heart doesn't beat, or your mother's heart doesn't beat. If you're using IoT to monitor the water level of your crops, and you're a farmer and you need those crops to survive in order for you and your family to survive and to feed your community, then if that sensor is broken, that means that you might not be able to save a crop from failure that year. You have to wait another year to replant the crop. So you and your family may not have the money you need, but also the community that you feed with that food will not have access to that food.
Yeah, indeed. It's not all Armageddon, folks. So we're not there yet. And
not yet.
Not yet.
We can build security in sustainably.
Absolutely. And that's what discussions and presentations like the one that you just did for us is helping.
Yeah.
It's helping to mitigate all those challenges and problems. Diana, thank you so much for your contribution and your immense insights. I would say there was so much takeaways from your session. I really appreciated that you came in and presented.
Thank you so much, Nasia. It's always wonderful to see you.
Same here, Diana. Well, folks, what a day has been. The past 2 panels totally threw out my plan for closing this IoT day. So we heard from wonderful people throughout the day, and I wanted to say thank you for staying with us, for joining us into this IoT journey today. Personally, I am filled with a sense of wonder as we're stepping out of this captivating tale of the interconnected world. I mean, from this morning, we journeyed through, in many ways, enchanted forest of knowledge. We soared in heights of innovation, and we delved deep in the dungeons of the challenges of what IoT presents, right? But as we heard from Diana, there's still time to mitigate all these challenges. We just need to foster good ways of setting up our IoT devices. Now, we covered from the immense zettabytes, of data of our devices that will generate, all the way to the puzzles of ethical IoT and how are we going to solve them. And the road ahead, I must say, for IoT is both thrilling and daunting. Yeah. We heard that the data is the heart of IoT, and that data needs to be protected end to end. Every data problem is a people problem. Yeah, we heard that as well from our panelists. Without connectivity, there is an IoT. Before we start our IoT proof of concept, the POCs, we need to look at the business case and make sure that what we're building, it makes sense for both our organization and our customers, and ensure that we are embedding security by design. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to IoT. Private 5G networks is a long game that will unravel in the next 5 or 10 years. 80% of IoT projects fail because devices fail. So it's very key. And enterprises need our help throughout the ecosystem and a lot of hand-holding, because our customers don't know what they don't know. So we need to make them aware of both the benefits and the challenges that come along with connected systems. Now, defining the risk correctly is one of the key challenges that companies face, but we need to face up to it and be open and ask and look for advice and invest on experts that will help us throughout the journey of us putting together IoT solutions. The value of IoT, folks, and the problems that we'll solve are immense, and it crosses across all industries. It goes across all industries and at all levels. It affects both B2C and B2B. So personally, I would say that if there was one element, one spell that I hope we all learned today, that is collaboratus. The power of coming together, sharing insights, and working in unison to ensure our connected future is bright, safe, sustainable, and equitable, right? So I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude for a wonderful lineup of speakers and panelists who shared their portion of wisdom. A big thank you again to our supporters that made this event possible: GTC, Tech Futures, and NVIDIA support IoT Now. And of course, I want to say a big thank you to all of you, the wanderers of the IoT world, for your participation and your engagement. As we go back to our daily lives after this event, please remember to take all the lessons and the insights and the connections that you made today, especially around the security and privacy and everything else that comes along. The magic doesn't stop here. It's just merely the beginning. At MEF, we have a dedicated working group for IoT where we meet monthly to discuss and explore this interconnected world. Reach out to us and we'll hope that we can meet with you and learn together a bit more. Now, before we close out the session, I would like to remind you all of a couple other events that we have coming up. On September 14th, we're going to have a webinar where we are going to unlock the value of IoT for enterprises. The details are on our website, so please, that's next week, next Thursday. Sign up. It will be a really nice panel. The next meetup that we at MEF will be holding is on September 18th, and that's in Amsterdam. If you're local or you're traveling, if you haven't signed up, the MEF meetups are always fun and educational places to be. And our next MEF Connects event is taking place on October 10th and 11th, and that will cover the whole spectrum of wholesale. And on the 11th itself, we will have a session around IoT. Now, my friends, until we meet again, keep casting those spells of innovation. Remain curious, and let's strive to make our world a little bit more magical, safer, connected, and sustainable. Why not with IoT? From all of us at MEF, thank you for joining us today. May the IoT force be with you. Ciao, ciao.